The snow was falling gently over the Appalachian ridge when Clara arrived at the edge of a life no one asked her opinion about. Just 19, she stood with a suitcase patched by hand and a heart worn by silence. In her town, she was the spare daughter, too quiet, too plain, too overlooked to ever attract a suitor on her own. That's why her family, without much ceremony, accepted the offer. A marriage proposal from a man deep in the mountains. She was not told his name, only that he was stable, God-fearing, and seeking a wife before the year turned. What kind of man chooses a wife by letter? Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our goal is to reach as many viewers as possible to keep bringing you stories like this one. And remember, those who watch until the end are always the first to be notified of our new uploads, so let the video play through, even if you're just listening. The carriage driver barely spoke as they climbed into fog-drenched woods. Cold bled through the windowpane. Clara held the paper in her glove, an address scribbled in charcoal, a note that simply read, "He will be waiting." But when they arrived, there was no welcoming party, no groom in sight, just a looming house of stone, ivy gripping its bones like secrets it refused to share. An elderly woman opened the door and stared for a moment too long. "You're earlier than expected," she murmured, before stepping aside. That's when Clara realized something wasn't right. But what troubled her more wasn't the silence. It was the sense that she was being watched from inside the house. The next morning, Clara was woken not by music or the sound of footsteps, but by the stillness of a house that seemed suspended in breath. Breakfast was laid out in the cold kitchen, but no one joined her. Only the elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Elkins, offered brief, curt words. "He's away for now," she said, slicing bread with trembling hands. "He expected you next week." Clara wanted to ask more, who he was, where he had gone, but every question was swallowed by silence. No one dared speak his name, not even the villagers she would meet later that day. Mrs. Elkins took Clara to the town chapel. She walked behind her, veil tucked, bouquet in hand, heart pounding louder with each step. But inside, the pews were nearly empty. Only a handful of villagers sat scattered, eyes darting, mouths drawn tight. The minister looked uncomfortable. "We'll begin shortly," he said. But the groom never arrived. After 37 minutes, someone whispered, "He's not coming." Embarrassed, Clara was taken back to the house without a ceremony, without vows, without answers. Not a single villager met her eyes as they passed. That night, the wind howled against the shutters as Clara stood before the mirror in her bridal dress. Untouched, unchosen. Somewhere in the house a floorboard creaked. She turned sharply but saw nothing. Or did she? Her reflection seemed different, like her own eyes weren't looking back. And then, behind her, a shadow moved past the doorframe. Not fast, not loud. Just enough to make her freeze. Someone was there, but why wouldn't anyone admit it? That first night in the mountains wrapped Clara in a cold, thicker than snow. The room they'd given her was vast and bare, save for a worn rocking chair and an old oak wardrobe whose mirror was clouded with time. She lay on the bed, still wearing her dress, as if taking it off would make the rejection more real. No one had come to check on her. No explanation had been offered, only silence, and the sound of a grandfather clock ticking somewhere deep in the house, counting down to something unknown. Unable to sleep, Clara wandered into the hallway, guided by the flicker of her candle. Each step felt like trespassing. She passed portraits with faces scratched or missing, as though someone had tried to erase memory itself. Just outside the study, she saw it. A folded slip of paper tucked between the pages of a dusty ledger. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was jagged but purposeful. It read, "Do not trust what they say. He is not the man you think. You weren't sent for love. You were sent to erase a name." There was no signature, only a faded wax seal shaped like a hawk. Clara clutched the note, pulse racing. What did it mean? Who left it, and for whom? She hurried back to her room, but the air had changed. The fire was lower, though no one had entered. Or had they? On her pillow lay a single pine sprig, freshly cut. Not there before. Her candle flickered once, then out. Something or someone was watching her far more closely than she ever realized. The next morning brought no answers. Only frost on the inside of the glass, and a silence so dense it seemed to press against Clara's skin. Determined to understand what was unfolding around her, she slipped away from Mrs. Elkins and explored the upper floor while the old woman tended to chores. The house was older than it appeared, with wings that creaked under weight and doors that resisted opening. But in a narrow hallway, behind a tapestry half torn from the wall, she found a hidden latch. It led to a cramped attic, filled with chests and broken furniture smelling of cedar and thyme. There, Clara uncovered a small trunk wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters, dozens, tied with faded green ribbon. Each was signed with the same name, Nathaniel S. Hawthorne. Not the author, she quickly realized, but someone who lived here. Someone erased. Tucked among the letters were sketches, a man with solemn eyes, a young girl in a bonnet, and one image scorched at the edges, a woman at a grave. Clara's hands shook. On the back was scribbled, "She never forgave me." Behind the trunk, propped against the rafters, she discovered a portrait with its canvas slashed in anger. She recognized the face, the eyes, from the sketch. And suddenly, the note from the night before made sense. Nathaniel wasn't just part of this house's past. He was the reason she was here. But why did no one speak of him? What had he done so terrible that even his name was buried in dust? The snow had begun to fall again by midday, thick and fast, swallowing the trail behind Clara as she wandered beyond the edge of the estate. She had followed the faint sound of a bell, faint, metallic, almost imagined, through the trees, until she realized she'd gone too far. The path had vanished. The silence of the forest was different from the house, heavier, expectant. Each step sank deeper into untouched snow, and soon the wind stole her breath and sense of direction. Panic settled in. She stumbled, falling hard on her hands, her legs too numb to rise. That's when she saw him, a shadow between the trees, moving against the white like ink in milk. He didn't call out, he didn't run. He simply appeared. A tall man in a wool coat, dark hair beneath a snow-dusted hat, and eyes that burned, not with fire, but with something older, quieter, pain. Without a word, he pulled her from the ground, wrapped her in his coat and carried her through the drifts as if she weighed nothing. His breath was steady, his silence unsettling. Back at the edge of the woods, he set her down near the old stable and vanished before she could speak. No one else saw him, no one believed her. Mrs. Elkins insisted, "No one lives that deep in the forest anymore." But Clara knew what she saw. The man's hands were real, his eyes were haunted, and around his neck, barely visible beneath his scarf, hung a pendant shaped like a hawk. For 2 days, Clara saw no trace of the man who had saved her, but she felt his presence. She wandered near the tree line, pretending to gather kindling, half hoping he'd return. And then, at twilight, he did. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, stepping from the shadows like someone who had always belonged there. She turned sharply, startled. "You left me in the snow." He nodded once. "You weren't ready for answers." His voice was low, gravelled, carrying something heavy between every word. "But now, you're starting to ask the right questions." He led her to a hollow cabin, hidden behind a wall of evergreens. It was sparse but warm. Books lined the walls. She saw sketches, the same style she found in the attic. "Nathaniel?" she asked. His breath caught. "Not anymore," he replied. "That man died when your father betrayed him." Her blood chilled. "You knew my father?" He nodded. "He was part of what happened to my family, to this land. You were sent here to wipe away a debt and a memory." Clara's throat tightened. All this time, she thought she was unwanted. But perhaps she was chosen, just not for the reason she believed. She stepped closer. "Why does no one speak your name?" His jaw clenched. "Because the truth costs more than most are willing to pay." A long silence passed. Then, with trembling fingers, he handed her a folded letter. "Your father wrote this the night he died. I never opened it. But maybe you should." Her hand brushed his as she took it. And in that touch, there was something unspoken. Clara returned to the village alone, the unopened letter trembling in her pocket like a second heartbeat. Faces turned as she passed, not with curiosity, but with guilt. That was new. She stopped at the chapel, where the minister stood lighting candles for no one. "You knew," she whispered. His hands froze. "Child," he started, but she interrupted. "What was the deal? Why was I sent here? Tell me." He looked away, voice thick. "Your father owed land and silence. The marriage was the price for both." Her breath caught. "So I was payment." That evening, Clara stood before the townspeople in the square. "You all kept it from me," she said, voice steady. "But why? Who is he to you?" An old woman finally spoke. "He's the one we couldn't forgive, but we couldn't forget him either." Whispers circled. Clara heard pieces, words like fire, inheritance, betrayal, bits of a story once buried like bones. Her father had promised her in marriage to clear a shame that wasn't hers to carry. Nathaniel was never the monster, but the village had painted him as one to protect themselves. Back at the house, Clara opened the letter. Her father's handwriting spilled across the page like regret. "If you're reading this, he's still alive. I failed him. And you. But he never stopped writing to me. I just never had the courage to write back. Forgive me if you can." Her tears fell silently, not just for what was written, but for everything left unsaid. Days passed, with a brittle stillness between them. Clara stayed near the main house, nursing questions she couldn't shape into words. Nathaniel kept his distance, tending to his own secluded world in the woods. But then, small things began to change. A fresh stack of firewood outside her door each morning, herbs left beside her tea, a new shawl, woven thick and warm, folded on the edge of her bed without a note. He never said it was him. He didn't have to. There was a softness in his absence. One afternoon, she found him in the orchard, pruning branches bare from winter. "Why do you help me?" she asked, not expecting an answer. He paused, then looked at her, not with apology, but something quieter. "Because no one ever helped me when I needed it," he said, "and you didn't run when they told you to." That confession, as simple as it was, cracked something open. Still, she sensed walls behind his words, layers sealed with silence. "What happened here, Nathaniel?" she asked. He only shook his head. Some truths cost too much to repeat. That night, when a storm howled through the valley, she found a candle already lit in her room, a second blanket, and beneath her pillow, one of the sketches he had drawn, her, sitting beneath the pine tree near the stream. She hadn't even seen him there. And it struck her then. Sometimes the loudest cries for connection are spoken without sound. But what was he still afraid to say? Clara never meant to find it. The small leather notebook was hidden beneath loose floorboards in the unused sitting room, where dust clung to time and no one ever swept. Its cover was cracked, stained with ash and oil, its spine broken in places. But when she opened it, Nathaniel's handwriting spilled across the pages like a voice he no longer dared to use. Line after line, she read not confessions, but memories soaked in grief. He wrote of a brother who vanished during a storm, a fire blamed on him, a fiancé who died before their wedding day, and a town that turned their mourning into accusation. "I was not what they said I was," one page read, "but I didn't have the strength to prove it. I let the silence protect them and punish me." Clara turned the pages slowly, her breath catching as she read of betrayals stitched into family, of his name erased not by guilt, but by collective shame. "I stopped speaking because no one listened. I built a house out of solitude, and then forgot how to leave it." She closed the diary with trembling hands. This wasn't the story the village told. This was the buried truth. And more than that, it was the heart of a man who had learned to survive without being seen. That night, she walked to the cabin without knocking. He stood by the fire, surprised to see her. Clara held out the book. "You don't have to explain," she whispered, "but you never deserved to carry this alone." There were no declarations, no grand gestures, just a quiet morning where Clara stayed longer by the fire, and Nathaniel didn't look away. Something shifted between them, not quickly, but with the care of something rebuilt from rubble. He began joining her for meals. She started tending the garden he had long let wither. Together they repaired shutters, mended broken chairs, rewrote the rhythm of the house with footsteps side by side. It was not romance in the way stories told. It was softer, realer. In the orchard she asked him, "What would you want if none of this had happened?" He took a long breath. "To be chosen, not tolerated, not forgiven, just chosen." She reached for his hand then, and this time he didn't pull away. The past still hung between them, but no longer as a ghost, more like a frame, something that once held pain, now repurposed for something healing. He began to laugh again, not often, but enough to remind her there had once been joy in him. She began to write too, letters to her late father, ones he would never read, but she needed to release. One night after supper, he handed her a box. Inside was the broken pendant, the hawk, reforged, now set into a brooch. "You are not here to erase a name," he said softly. "You're here to write your own beside mine, if you still wish to." And with that, something inside Clara finally said yes, not to the past, but to the future they could shape together. Spring broke over the valley with a gentler sun and whispers of green returning to the trees. Clara and Nathaniel stood at the edge of the village road, shoulder to shoulder, not as strangers, but as something forged in silence and softened by truth. He hadn't stepped into the village square in more than a decade, but today he walked beside her, chin lifted, eyes forward, each step an act of quiet defiance. The hawk brooch she wore glinted in the morning light, and those who remembered its shape lowered their gaze. At the chapel, the bell tolled, not for mourning, not for marriage, but for reckoning. Clara stepped inside first, her voice calm. "You feared his name because you never faced your part in his silence." The villagers shifted. Murmurs rose. But Nathaniel didn't flinch. He stepped forward, unfolded the letter her father had written, and read it aloud. Regret, truth, confession spilled like wine on white cloth. There was no anger in his tone, only release. And when he finished, the silence that followed was different, not cold, not tense, just still. The minister stepped down from the altar, removing his hat. "Forgiveness," he said, "sometimes comes dressed as courage." One by one, heads bowed. The past could not be erased, but it could be faced. And in that chapel, with her hand in his, Clara realized that love doesn't always arrive in fanfare. Sometimes it walks quietly beside you until the world has no choice but to notice. Years later, the house on the ridge was no longer silent. Laughter echoed in the halls where whispers once lived. Clara walked through the orchard with her daughter, now 7, curious and unafraid. "Mama," the child asked, brushing petals from her hair, "why do you and Papa always say this house chose you?" Clara smiled softly. "Because it held a story no one wanted to hear, until we stayed long enough to listen." The child nodded, as if she understood, then skipped ahead to chase the wind. In the distance, Nathaniel watched from the porch, a book in his lap, lines of age at his eyes, but peace too. Inside, the journal remained on the mantel, pages no longer locked away, but read and reread by those who wanted to know the truth. Villagers visited now, not with suspicion, but with pies, books, and folded apologies. Some things were never spoken aloud, but they didn't need to be. The land forgave slowly, like the thaw of snow. Clara's letters to her father, once hidden, had become stories her daughter would one day tell her own children, about sorrow and silence and the way love grew in unexpected soil. And on some evenings, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Clara would sit at the window and remember the girl who had arrived, invisible and unsure. She was no longer that girl. She had chosen to stay, to see, to believe in someone who had been forgotten. And when Nathaniel joined her, taking her hand without a word, she knew some love stories aren't loud, they echo through generations.